What's up, y'all? My name is JR, and for those of you who don't already know, I'm a huge movie and TV nerd. If you're new here, I appreciate you taking the time to check out my channel. I hope you consider sticking around and joining the film community I'm trying to build here on YouTube. So in today's video, I'm going to be giving a recap, reaction, analysis, and review of the first episode in the third season of the Netflix biographical crime drama anthology series, Monster. And this season is entitled The Ed Gein Story. And just so you guys know, this video will contain spoilers, so if for some reason you haven't gotten around to watching the first episode of this season yet, and you don't want to know anything that happens in it, you might want to exit this video now. And with that being said, no more wasting time. Let's get into it. Monster, The Ed Gein Story is the third season of the American-made biographical crime drama anthology series Monster, created by Ian Brennan for Netflix. The season focuses on convicted serial killer Ed Gein, played by Charlie Hunnam, and other main characters including Gein's mother, Augusta, played by Laurie Metcalf, film director Alfred Hitchcock, played by Tom Hollander, and Hitchcock's wife, screenwriter and film editor Alma Reville, played by Olivia Williams. And the season was released on Netflix on October 3rd of this year. Now, at the time of the making of this video, the anthology series has a 50% on Rotten Tomatoes, based on only 10 critic reviews, but its popcorn meter currently sits comfortably at 65%, based on over 100 verified ratings. The series has a Metascore of just 33 on Metacritic, based on only 5 critic reviews, and it doesn't have a user score yet, likely due to the series just having been released on yesterday. And finally, the series overall has a 7.8 out of 10 on IMDb, with almost 200,000 ratings. So, I'll be honest with you guys that I'm not typically into these kinds of series, mostly because I just don't like to think about the kind of men who do these kinds of things. The things that these men have done throughout history. But when I saw that my man Charlie Hunnam was playing the title character, I thought I would at least give it a shot. And what I've seen so far has been pretty interesting, an artistic take on a real-life examination of one of America's most infamous serial killers. And I'll just leave it at that for my initial thoughts. Now, episode 1, entitled Mother, begins on a rather bleak-looking winter morning in rural Wisconsin. And we meet Ed Gein, a seemingly quiet, socially awkward man, as he tends to his chores around the family's farm out in the middle of nowhere. His life seems to revolve almost entirely around his extremely devout and controlling mother, Augusta, whose strict religious views strongly condemn sexuality of any kind and contact with, as Augusta refers to as sinful women, right? Now, later that day, Ed sneaks to a nearby house to spy on 2 young women, Adeline and Madison, as they try on lingerie, the bullet bra. As the women talk about what they believe boys like, that being the bullet bra, Adeline appears to hear a sound coming from outside of her bedroom door, which is cracked, logistics. Now, Ed panics and he flees in response, leaving the front door wide the hell open, right? And it's worth mentioning here that when Adeline finally creeps down the stairs and she sees the front door ajar, a smile kind of comes across her face in response, as though she knows exactly who it was and what he was doing there. Now, back home, we find that Ed has put on his mother's undergarments, fashioned a noose, and placed it around his neck as he, I'll just say, pleasures himself in sort of a ritualistic form of sexual self-punishment. His mother then catches him in the act, and she reacts with pure fury, reminding him that any woman outside of her moral code, her religious code, is a Jezebel, and especially Adeline. Now, even later that day, at a local diner, we learn that Ed and Adeline actually know each other. And this is why she smiled at the open door. She knew it was Ed, so apparently, she knows he likes her, and she likes him back, at least to some degree. Now, Adeline, fascinated by dark history and photography, especially that involving Nazis and their concentration camps, shares disturbing photos of the concentration camp victims and a sensational magazine about war criminal Issa Koch. I think I said her name right. Infamous for ordering the deaths of incarcerated Jews and even crafting human skin-like keepsakes. Ooh. Ed seems unsettled by these items, but he also seems visibly drawn to the grotesque images, planting seeds for the obsession that will ultimately go on to define him as a serial killer. Now, later, we see Ed with his older brother Henry out in the barn. And Henry, tired of Augusta's domineering ways, plans to leave, and he urges Ed to do the same. Now, Ed, unwilling to abandon his mother's control, lashes out, ultimately striking Henry in the back of the head with a nearby log and leaving him for dead in the barn. But almost immediately after the incident, we see that Ed experiences a brief hallucination, believing that Henry just stood up after being hit across the head and playfully threatening to expose him. But the next day, when he enters the barn, he finds Henry's body still laying there lifeless. Now, in response, Ed panics and decides to burn the corpse under brush out in the field, hoping to convince his mother that this was simply a tragic accident. The police arrive, and they tend to believe Ed's account, though the medical examiner at the morgue quietly notes signs of asphyxiation. Now, soon after, Augusta, in her immense grief over the loss of what we find out is her favorite son, suffers a stroke. So now Ed has to look after her. He takes her home from the hospital. He has to dress her and feed her and give her medication and wash her. And as he does this, we get scenes that involve Issa Koch and her family in Germany. We see her at a party that she's hosting with lots of soldiers there and Jewish prisoners. And we get a chance to see how they view these people and how they treat them. Now, back on the farm, we see how Ed struggles to take care of Augusta, even though over time she seems to get better because she gets to the point where she can walk with a cane. But she ultimately dies from a heart attack as she attempts to extract payment from a nearby farmer for planting on their land. Ed, now completely untethered by the death of his mother, begins hearing her voice urging him to keep her close. And the voice convinces Ed to go and dig up her grave. But when he can't do that, he instead exhumes a nearby woman, cleaning the body and seating it in Augusta's favorite rocking chair. And the episode ends with Ed staring lovingly at the corpse, his grief leading to his madness fully emerging. And this is where the episode cuts to black. Now, first, I think both the writer of the episode, Ian Brennan, and Charlie Hunnam do an excellent job of both making you afraid of this dude almost immediately. There's just something about this guy where you kind of, as soon as you see him, you kind of go, that's a weirdo. The episode starts off with this huge sense of foreboding. And a lot of that is due to you understanding who and what it is you're watching, but it's also the way in which Hunnam approaches the character, even down to his voice, maybe even especially his voice, I found it really interesting that Adeline seemed happy, maybe even turned on a bit by the idea that Ed may have been watching her half naked in her room. I think it says a lot about female nature, even back in 1945, a time when women's sexuality would have been much more suppressed. We see that by Ed's mother's behavior, imploring him to stay away from quote-unquote sinful women, she thinks that female sexuality is essentially the root of all evil, a sentiment that I can understand would have been prevalent at the time. But his mother just kind of takes it like to the 45th power, if you know what I'm saying. The most interesting thing to me, however, about this entire episode was seeing all the ways in which Ed Gein's personality and his documented and maybe even some undocumented experiences may have inspired Hitchcock in the creation of Norman Bates and the events that take place in his 1960 horror film Psycho, and even how that would go on to inspire the version of Norman Bates that we get, and to some extent Norma Bates, and the events of the story that we saw in the 2013 thriller television series Bates Motel, right? I find it interesting also as a self-proclaimed history nerd that Ed was so taken by Issa Koch and her exploits in the concentration camps during the war. It did send me down a rabbit hole to find out more information about her specifically, which I found to be both interesting and informative. And even though there will be some people who feel like we didn't need the scenes in Germany, that we already had the comic book and a description of what the pages of said magazine contained, that we could have done without the actual scenes here. And, I guess that's fair. But I'll get into a little bit of that here in just a second. Now, I would contend that, just from a basic standpoint, we get these scenes because Ian Brennan needed to pad the episode. It may have been an attempt at a creative flourish, sure, but this episode was a bit on the short side, so I understand that he may have felt like he needed something to extend the runtime a bit here. I didn't mind it so much, though, again, being, like I said, a person who takes every opportunity I can to both visualize and contextualize world history. So that's my 2 cents on that. But like I said, we'll circle back around to that a little bit more here later in the video. Now, the writing in this episode I thought was extremely purposeful. Though in situations like this, I can understand why it could feel that way. I assume, especially by now, that there would be tons of information in the way of police reports and documentary notes and even footage that could be used in order to produce a miniseries that would be extremely accurate as to it pertains to Ed Gein and his family and even his victims. Now, I thought the acting here was really good. And I thought Charlie Hunnam I find that he's doing a great job so far bringing this monster to life, if you will, both in showing his propensity for violence and humanizing him, which I do think is really important in content like this. It's not all about the one thing. It has to be about the other two, because if not, why do we give a shit? You get what I'm saying? If you're just going to run down a list of some shit that a person did that you find to be reprehensible, you don't need a series to do that, right? You can just make a bullet-pointed list, and we can go on with our lives. I think the writer and the director's ability to both show us the world that Ed exists in, that being the real world, and show us the world that Ed kind of creates in his mind, just adds another layer of intrigue here that helps the episode's flow, right? And, all things considered, I thought this episode was both immersive and informative in a way that makes me want to keep watching, despite my initial hesitation, like I said, to consume this kind of content. Now, in my analysis, the writing in this episode focuses on just a single narrative, and that might also be a reason why the episode was short, right? Because you don't really have an A story, B story, C story here. You just have an A story. That being Ed coming home in Act 1 and living and dealing with his mother and her strict religious rules and worldview, and then losing her little by little until he's finally left all alone to face life without her. Act 1 went on for about 12 minutes and 54 seconds. I tell you guys, in an hour long, you're probably looking at, of course, depending on the runtime of the exact episode, somewhere between 12 and 15 minutes per act. So I'm going to say that Act 1 was about right on time. Now, I've told you guys that, as a rule of thumb, anything that takes place before the title is likely a teaser. In this case, I feel differently, though, mostly because of how long this section of the story is and how deep we actually get into the story here. Also, there are only 3 acts after this one, which tells me that this is, in fact, Act 1 of the story and not the teaser, as you wouldn't typically have a teaser and then only 3 acts in an hour-long drama. Especially with the teaser being, nearly longer than any of the other 3 acts that follow. Now, the first act starts with Ed arriving home, as I said. It involves him doing his chores, sneaking out to spy on Adeline, punishing himself for having done so, getting caught and berated for his actions by his mother, and finally ending with him meeting Adeline at the diner and getting the box of photographs and the magazine from her. Now, the primary purpose, again, of Act 1 is essentially to set up the story. And this is where we're introduced to the title character, Ed Gein, played by Hunnam, and the people around him. In this case, that would include Augusta, Ed's mother, Henry, his older brother, and Adeline, his bae? I don't know. She's something. But here, we're also introduced to Ed's world as it exists before the inciting incident happens, right? And that being the thing that changes everything. In this case, that would be his mother's death. That doesn't come until nearly the end of the episode. But that would be the inciting incident of the season, right? Just for GP. And here we should also be made to understand the characters' motivations, as I always tell you guys, their goals and their internal conflicts. In this story, we see that Ed very badly wants to be the kind of son his mother could not only love, but the kind of son she could also be proud of. And he struggles with trying to live by her strict religious rules and trying to fight his own personal demons at the same time. We also get the overall theme of the story we're being told. Here, the main theme being the complex relationship between nature and nurture in creating a monster, right? Questioning whether or not individuals are born the way they are or they're made the way that they become through their experiences, particularly isolation, psychosis, and deeply ingrained obsession here, specifically, that Ed has with his own mother. The series also explores societal factors and how the cultural obsession with true crime and deviant behavior influenced and potentially contributed to Gein's actions and what would become his legacy, right? Now, the second act starts with Ed reading his Bitch of Buchenwald magazine. He's on them pages, boy. Briefly, before meeting his older brother Henry in the barn and them having the conversation about abandoning their mother, and Ed killing his brother in response. It also includes Ed experiencing the hallucination that takes place right after, believing that his brother survived the attack and looks to make things right with their mother. Later, Ed talks to his mother about Henry, and she explains to him that she had not spoken to him because he still thinks at this point that Henry is alive, but that he's probably going to run off with that girl he likes, that he isn't really her son, and that she really wanted him, and him, I mean Ed, to be a girl. Now, the next day, Ed realizes that he, in fact, did kill his brother when he goes back to the barn, and he panics, stages the accident out in the field before getting his mother to call the police. They briefly investigate, rule it an accident, though the medical examiner thinks it could have been asphyxiation. Ed then arrives home to find his mother distraught to the point of experiencing a stroke. And Act 2 is the longest act in this particular episode. It's 14 minutes and 33 seconds. So like I said, between 12 and 15 minutes, so still right there kind of where it needs to be. And look, in a perfect world, each act would be the exact same amount of time, but you just can't, it just doesn't work that way. So, again, not going to eat the writer's lunch for this. Like I said, if it's between 12 and 15 minutes, then it's all good in my book. But this act makes it clear that Ed is completely obsessed with the depictions of torture in the magazine he received from Adeline, that he's mentally ill as well, that his mother had wished he was both someone and something different, which, had to kind of play on, his kind of being so emotionally distraught and some of the psychosis that he kind of dealt with. And it might even have something to do with why he's putting on girls, undergarments and stuff like that, right? His mom was telling him, I wish you were a girl. There's probably part of him that thinks, well, the only way to please my mom is for me to be feminine in some ways. And that he will go on to be controlled by his mother, desperately, again, seeking her approval, to now having it go to being the other way around, being the one who will ultimately have to take care of her, and how that will impact him and his psychological state even further. Now, in Act 3, we see that Augusta indeed survived her stroke, but that she will need to be rehabilitated with her son's help. He takes her home in her wheelchair, and he has to feed her, clothe her, give her medicine, and wash her. And we see, as he's washing her, and he's, remembering some of the things depicted in the magazine, where Isaac would, clean the dead bodies of Jewish people that were in the concentration camps. We see a real life depiction of Isaac in Germany. As Ed continues reading the magazine, we then see that Augusta has made great progress, so some time has passed here. She's walking with a cane, demanding to be taken to a neighbor's house to collect the rent due for his planting on their land. But when they arrive, she sees that he has a woman living with him, and she becomes irate, Jezebel, right, to the point of having a heart attack and dying. And in Act 3 only lasts about 10 minutes and 56 seconds. And again, this is why I think this is where the writer decided to add the whole let's go to Germany, see what Isakak is up to and that kind of thing, because he's looking at the script and the story and going, this act is not going to be anywhere near long enough. So he has to kind of bide his time and kind of mark time and make the episode longer. And this is where he chose to do it, because if you take those scenes out in Germany, Act 3 is like 6 minutes. And that's just too short. You just can't have that. This one's almost 11 minutes, so it's still about 60 seconds light. And so what I would tell the people who are saying, well, we didn't really need those scenes in Germany, I'm telling you right now, that's why you have them. That's exactly why you have them, because as he's pacing out the episode, he's going, oh my God, Act 3 is too short. I got to put something here. And so he did. And the third act is typically when the characters find their lowest point, right? And this rings true here. In the second act, again, there may have been some general hope, but the third act shows up and crushes that hope. And a new or an evolved conflict takes shape. And here, that being Augusta's impairment in Act 2, and then her untimely death in Act 3. In layman's terms, Ed has a plan. That plan may have been his mother's full recovery, and that plan is dashed when she keels over dead, right? So again, I always tell you guys, that's how you know that you're dealing with Act 3, because Act 3 is typically going to be in the same vein the entirety. No matter what's going on, your Act 3 is going to consist of something like that, complications, if you will, right? And lastly, in this case, we have an Act 4, right, which includes Augusta's funeral. Ed at home, hearing his mother's voice, urging him to bring her back by digging her up and returning her home, right? That's some wild shit, boy. Ed then going to the cemetery and attempting that feat, but failing, ultimately deciding to exhume the woman in the grave next to her instead, because, a body's a body, right? And finally bringing the corpse home, sitting it in his mother's favorite chair, dressing it in his mother's clothes, and then gazing upon it fondly. I ain't gonna lie, dog, that was a creepy-ass stare at the end, boy. And like I said, given what this story is about, Charlie Hunnam did his thing. And the fourth act is typically where the main character applies the lessons learned to finally overcome the central conflict, leading to some sort of resolution. And also it sets up the story to come in future episodes. And here the central conflict was dealing with his mother and her strict rules. And here Ed overcomes that particular conflict because, his mother died. And though, that might not have been what Ed wanted, it still achieves the goal, right, is to get his mom off his back, essentially, so that he can kind of have some room to breathe. And, again, and this might not have been done at the hands of Ed, like in most cases, it'll be the protagonist will do something specifically that will lead to the resolution. But here, Ed was just kind of a victim of circumstance. But again, the outcome is still the same, right? Now, overall, I'd give this episode an 80%, or an 8.0 out of 10 if you're thinking IMDb score. A B, essentially, as a letter grade. And look, I've already told you guys, I don't typically like to consume this kind of content because it makes me uneasy to think about the fact that there were and are people out here who have done truly horrific things to other people, especially innocent people who maybe didn't really deserve it. But in the name of giving people what they want, I decided to give this one a shot, right? Diversifying content and all. And I have to say that for the most part, this was fairly well done. And I know there are some that don't like the humanistic and romantic tone that shows like this can sometimes have. But people have to get out of their feelings with that kind of thing, because this is a show that's based on the life and the crimes of Ed Gein. We can all agree, a terrible man with extremely violent tendencies who also happened to be very sick, right? More than one thing can be true. And I think it's perfectly fine to explore his humanity as we dissect the horrible things, like I said, that he did. And I understand that there are some things that both the writer and director of these things editorialize and even sensationalize in order to make for a more enjoyable watching experience. And I think that if you are the kind of person who just doesn't like that, right, I think it's perfectly fine. But that I would also say you should probably just stick to watching documentaries, right? This man inspired Norman Bates in Psycho and in Bates Motel, two projects that humanize him. The second one to great extent. If you've ever watched Bates Motel, Norman Bates was humanized to a great degree. But, both things can be true. He could be a sweet boy, and he was also extremely dangerous. Now, this man also appears to have inspired Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, so if you've watched any of them, then you're perfectly fine with the humanity of serial killers, like I said. And I am willing, especially as a creator myself and as a screenwriter, to let this piece be exactly what it is, judging this particular work only on its narrative and artistic merit. And that's it. And though I haven't watched any episode past the first one yet, I want to be clear about that. I think this was a pretty good start to what I imagine will be a pretty interesting journey into the life and mind of a truly notorious serial killer. But what do you guys think? Have you had a chance to watch the first episode in season 3 of Monster yet? If you have, what did you think about the tone of this season? What did you think about the writer's brazen attempt to humanize Ed Gein in this story? Let me know in the comments. And for those of you that might be new to the channel, be sure to like and share this video. If you really like the content, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. That way you'll be notified whenever I drop a new video. You can also now support the channel by leaving a super thanks. If you should be so inclined, I'd greatly appreciate it. Also, feel free to subscribe to my new Shorts channel for additional content. Also, feel free to subscribe to my new Reaction and Reviews channel. Both links are in the description. In addition, be sure to go and check out themadscreenwriter.com for more television and film reviews and info on my upcoming film projects. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. I got screenplays to write. And I'll catch y'all on the next video.